Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is part 7 of a video series where I'm attempting to explain every Sudoku solve technique. In parts 1 through 6, we covered basic techniques, advanced groups, fish, single-digit chains, multi-digit chains, and forcing chains, respectively. Make sure to go watch those videos. There will be a link to those in the description. And those last 3 videos on chains are going to be especially necessary for kind of understanding what's going on in this video. But anyway, at the end of the last part, the forcing chains and nets that we were covering ended up getting really complicated. And in order to keep track of all the strong and weak links, um, the grid started getting really cluttered up with all sorts of lines crisscrossing all over the place. So in this video, we want to cover coloring techniques, which follows a very similar logic to chain techniques, but it allows us to keep track of the candidates in what I think is a much more intuitive way. So let's get into it. For the techniques in this video, we're still going to be using a pretty similar logic as we did in the chains video, and we're still going to be talking about strong links and weak links. But instead of using these lines, we're going to be using colors to keep track of the states of the candidates in the grid. And when we have candidates that are in the same coloring scheme, we're going to call that a cluster, and the colors will represent the parity of that cluster, or one of the potential states that a candidate can be in. So let's look at how we can apply these coloring techniques to make some eliminations. Simple coloring, as the name implies, is the easiest form of coloring, and that's because it only focuses on a single digit, it only focuses on a single cluster, and that cluster is entirely composed of strong links, so it can be completely mapped by 2 parities. So to kind of demonstrate what that looks like, we have a grid here from Sudopedia. And we're going to go and focus on 3s for this grid. As I said, it's a single digit technique, so 3 is the only thing we're going to want to pay attention to. You could see that these 2 3s are bilocal in this column. So they would form a strong link, and therefore that could be subject to coloring. So we know that one of these 3s is going to be true. So let's color one of them blue and one of them yellow. And those are going to be our 2 parities for this cluster. And we can see that this yellow 3 is strongly linked to this 3. So we can go and color this 3 blue. And this blue 3 is strongly linked to this 3. So we'll color that one yellow. And so these 4 3s, among them, there's really only 2 options. Both of them can be these blue 3s, or both can be these yellow 3s. But there is a 3 on this grid which sees both a blue and a yellow 3, and it is this 3 right here. And we know that's impossible because if either the blue 3s have to be true or the yellow 3s have to be true, this 3 would eliminate both blue and yellow, which is a contradiction. So we can go ahead and eliminate this 3. And that's an example of what's called a color trap, which is when one of our candidates sees both parities of a cluster. And this is actually can be replicated by a very simple chain. This is actually a 2-string kite. And I know I said no lines a second ago, but just to kind of show what that would look like, that is what the actual chain would look like. So this specific elimination is very simple, but in a grid where we have a really large cluster, it's not quite as easy to see. And even though this is an example of simple coloring, we could actually start to see how this can kind of be extended to the concept of a verity forcing chain, because we examined both possible states of our 3s and came to a conclusion about a candidate that was the same under both states. And that's how we got to that elimination. So that's one way we can cause an elimination with simple coloring. The other way we can eliminate with simple coloring is called a color wrap, where we're able to eliminate one of the parities entirely because it causes a contradiction. So here's another grid from Sudopedia, and we're going to go ahead and be focusing on the 1s here. And there's a lot of places I could start, but I want to go ahead and start with this one because it has a lot of strong links, and I'll just color it blue. And we can see it's strongly linked to these 3 1s. So if this one is false, these 3 1s must be true. I'm going to go ahead and color all 3 of those yellow, and that's going to be our other parity. And we could essentially just continue to propagate through strong links here and color anything that's strongly linked to our yellows. And then color yellow anything that's strongly linked to those blues. And I believe this is as far as we can go with the color mapping here. But you might notice that there are some issues with this mapping, specifically with our yellow parity here. Um, we could see that these two ones are both colored yellow in the same box, and these two ones are both colored yellow in the same column. So if our yellow parity was true, there would be a contradiction because we would have a candidate of the same digit multiple times in a house. And this is obviously against the rules of Sudoku. So what we could actually do is eliminate this parity entirely because if one of these is true, if one of these yellow ones is true, all the rest must be true. So we could eliminate all of them, and this can kind of show how powerful um, simple coloring is because these color wraps can result in multiple different eliminations at the same time. And if you only have two parities, then by eliminating one, you know the other one must be true. So by extension, we could actually fill in all of these ones. And by doing that, we basically fill in all the ones in the grid because our only remaining one that wasn't colored just becomes a hidden symbol. And that is the power of simple coloring. So multicoloring happens when we analyze the interactions between multiple different clusters. We're still only looking at a single digit, and we're still only focusing on clusters that could be entirely composed of strong links. But this allows us to relax that one cluster limitation we had with simple coloring techniques. So here we have another grid from Sudopedia, and 8 is going to be the digit we're focusing on. So looking at this grid, we can see there are a couple strong links with the 8s, especially right here. All of these 8s are strongly linked together. So we could form those into a cluster. If we marked this 8 blue, then we would mark these two strongly linked 8s yellow, and then this strongly linked 8 blue. Now, if we look at the other strong links in this grid, we could see these two 8s in this row are bilocal, but they are not strongly linked to our first cluster. So we can't really integrate them into our first cluster. So we'll have to form a second cluster. Let's say we color this 8 green and this 8 red. So either this green 8 is going to be true or this red 8 is going to be true. And either these yellow 8s are going to be true in cluster 1 or these blue 8s are going to be true in cluster 1. So the thing you might notice is if the yellow 8s in cluster 1 are true, that eliminates both the green and the red 8 in cluster 2 because it sees both ends of that parity. And we know that's impossible because one of those parities in cluster 2 has to be true. So that means these yellow 8s can actually be eliminated. So in summary, if one of your parities in cluster 1 sees both ends of a parity in cluster 2, we could eliminate that parity in cluster 1. That's one way to make eliminations using multicoloring. Another way to eliminate using multicoloring is to force two independent parities to see each other. So here's another grid from Sudopedia, and the digit we're going to be focusing on is a 2. So we could see that these 2s are all strongly linked. So I'm going to go ahead and color this blue, yellow, blue, and that's going to be our first cluster. And we could also see these 2s are strongly linked, not to the first cluster, but within a separate cluster. So I'm going to go ahead and color that green, red, green. And we could see that our blues in cluster 1 see our greens in cluster 2. And this doesn't necessarily mean either of them is wrong. It just means that they can't coexist. So either we have blue in cluster 1 and red in cluster 2, or we have yellow in cluster 1 and green in cluster 2. We can't have blue in cluster 1 and green in cluster 2. So anything that would force blue to be true in cluster 1 and green to be true in cluster 2 can then be eliminated. And one way we could force that to happen is if we had an external candidate that eliminates yellow and red. And there is one candidate that sees both our yellow and red parity, and it is this candidate right here. It's this 2. If this 2 was true, that would force this red parity to be false, and that would force these greens to be true, and it would force this yellow parity to be false, and it would force these blues to be true. And then those greens and blues would see each other, and that would create a contradiction. So therefore, we have to eliminate this 2. So in multicoloring, if your two clusters see each other, you could eliminate any parities that see both ends of another parity. and you could eliminate any candidates that force mutually exclusive parities to be together. Weak coloring is when we relax that strong link only constraint from simple coloring, and it allows us to make many of the same eliminations that we would be able to make with multicoloring. So it's kind of a good alternative. Here we have another grid from Sudopedia, and the digit we're going to be focusing on with this grid is the twos. And there are a couple strong links between the twos in this grid, but we really want to focus on this strong link um, in our bottom row between these two twos that are bilocal in this row. So let's say we color one in blue and one in yellow. So there aren't really any strong links that we could go directly from here, but you might notice that this yellow two sees these twos in this top left box here. And these twos are strongly linked to this two. So if this yellow two is true, this yellow two also must be true. Um, and that is how we can kind of use a weak link to continue our parity. Now, doesn't really allow us to extend the full cluster because it tells us nothing about our blue parity, but it does allow us to extend one parity independently from the other. And just from this single conclusion, we could see that there's a two that sees both the blue and the yellow parity, which essentially forms a color trap. So we can eliminate this two that sees both parities. So that's classic weak coloring, where we use the implications from one cell at a time using this kind of empty rectangle pattern. We only needed one yellow cell in order to determine that this cell was also yellow. But we could also extend this to where we use implications from multiple different cells of one parity in order to find the next candidate for that parity. And that is called extended coloring, or X coloring for short. So here's another grid from Sudopedia, and sixes are going to be the digit we're going to focus on. So we could see these three sixes are strongly linked. Let's go ahead and color those blue and yellow. Now, let's say that we want to continue with our blue parity here. Well, we could see this six is weakly linked to this six, which is then strongly linked to this six. So we could say if this six is true, then this six must also be true. So we can go ahead and extend that in terms of our blue parity from that weak link. And then we could also extend it from this other end. If this blue six is true, this six must also be blue. And we could see that if this blue six and if this blue six are true, that eliminates four different cells in this box here. And that means this six must also be blue. So we could kind of use multiple different cells in order to continue that blue parity. And then we could see that we have a blue six and a yellow six just in this first row, which means we could eliminate all other sixes because they would see both ends of this parity. So by using weak links, we could extend our parities independently of each other, and that can allow us to make a lot of eliminations. 3D Medusa is essentially when we extend coloring into a multi-digit technique, which allows us to drop that single-digit constraint, the final constraint, in simple coloring. And it allows us to make use of strong links between different digits in the same cell instead of just using strong links between the same digit in different cells. So here we have another grid from Sudopedia, and you'll notice this grid has a lot of bi-value cells. Now, this is a good hint that multi-digit techniques are going to be necessary. So in the context of coloring, this means we got to use some 3D Medusas. So we're going to go ahead and start with this bi-value 3 and 8 here, and we're going to color this 3 blue and this 8 yellow. So those are going to be our two parities, and we know those are the parities because these are the only two possibilities in this cell. So we have this other 3 and 8 in the same row. Those are just going to be the opposite parity, with the 8 being blue and the 3 being yellow. And then another of 3 and 8 in the same box here, color that the opposite parity. And what we could do is we could just go through this grid and keep looking for strong links. So this is as far as I can go with this cluster for the 3D Medusa. But if we look through our parities here, you'll notice that this cell, the 7 in this cell, is seen by both a blue and a yellow parity, which means it falls into a color trap, and therefore we can go ahead and eliminate that 7. So This 3D Medusa is a very powerful technique. If you color a really large cluster like this, you're almost guaranteed to find something. Um, and when you combine this with multicoloring and extended coloring, you could replicate pretty much any forcing chain. So, very useful technique to have. Graded equivalence marks let us incorporate weak links into our multi-digit coloring scheme and allow us to test out conditional states based on whether a certain parity is true or false. They're based on just regular equivalence marks, which is essentially identical to the coloring that we've been talking about, but instead of using colors, it uses a single or double apostrophe to indicate the parity of a candidate. Graded equivalence marks build on this by adding two different grades. There are super marks, which state whether a candidate is true given that a parity is true. So, for example, a supermarker for parity 1 would state this candidate is true given that parity 1 is true. Then there are also submarkers which state a given candidate is false given that that parity is false. So, typically, graded equivalence marks isn't actually done using colors, it's done using symbols. Just like how regular equivalence marks is single and double apostrophe to indicate the parity, the supermarker would be a single or double line, and the submarker would be a single or double dot. But in this case, we are just going to use colors because we have colors available. So I'm going to continue using blue and yellow to mark the parity. Then I'm going to go ahead and use purple and red to be the submarkers for blue and yellow respectively. And I'll use green and orange to be the supermarkers for blue and yellow respectively. So here we have a grid from Sudopedia, and we're just going to go ahead and start off coloring this like a 3D Medusa. We're going to start with the central cell here, and we can see its by value. So that's going to be our two parities, yellow and blue. We'll color that 6 to yellow and the 4 to blue. And I want to go ahead and color the rest of this in the 3D Medusa. So that's as far as we can color with this cluster using 3D Medusa. But let's go ahead and pull out our super and submarks to see if we can make any conclusions using graded equivalence. So one thing you might notice is that in the cells where we have more than two values that aren't fully mapped by our cluster, a lot of those cells have eights in them. So let's see what we could explore about these eights. So one thing with graded equivalence marks is whenever we have a weak link between one parity to an uncolored candidate, what we could do is we can color that candidate with the submarker for the opposite parity. So for example, um, this yellow 5 is weakly linked to this 8. Therefore, we can mark it with a submarker for our blue parity, which is purple, as we defined it. And basically what this is saying is that if our blue parity is false, which would mean our yellow parity is true, then our 8 is false. So that holds up because, again, our 8 sees our yellow 5. So we can go ahead and mark anything in the same cell, any 8 in the same cell as a yellow candidate with purple. So that would include these two cells. And we could do that for all of the other candidates in these cells as well, but so as to not clutter up the grid too much, I'm just going to focus on the 8s now. And then we could do the same thing for our cells with blue candidates. We can color those with a submarker for our yellow parity, which is going to be red. So that's going to be these two 8s. So another propagation rule for our graded marks is whenever we have a strong link between a submarker, then we could color the strongly linked candidate with a supermarker of the opposite parity. And the reason this is because if a candidate is false when their parity is false, that means the opposite parity must be true, then the strongly linked candidate must be true. So therefore, we could apply a supermark for the opposite parity. So the only case where this happens with 8s is these 8s that are bilocal in this row. So you'll see this 8, which is submarked for blue, is strongly linked to this 8, which means we could supermark it for yellow. So the color we assign for that would be orange. And just to double check, do a little sanity check here. If our blue marker is false, that means our yellow marker is true, which would mean our 8's false. Since this 8 is strongly linked to this 8, this means this 8 would be true. Therefore, if our yellow parity is true, this 8 is true. That's how we get to that conclusion for supermarking this 8. Then the next propagation rule we have is anything that a supermark is linked to can then be submarked for the opposite parity. So that would include this 4 and these two 8s. That is what this 8 is weakly linked to. And that's because if our yellow parity was true, then this 8 would be true, which would make these 3 candidates we just colored false. Which means if our parity was not blue, aka yellow, then these candidates would be false, which is how we define the submarking for blue. So now we actually see a really interesting thing in this row here. We have all of our 8s are marked with a submarker for blue, except for this 8, which is marked with a submarker for red. So this gives us another propagation rule, where if we only have one submarked candidate in a row or box or column, whereas all of the other candidates are submarked for the opposite parity, we could actually upgrade that one candidate to a parity marking instead of just a submarking. And the reason this is because if we assumed our blue parity was false, then that would make all 3 of these 8s false, which would force this 8 to be true. So if our blue parity is false, this 8 is true. But if our blue parity is true, this 8 is false. So it's not really a conditional thing anymore. We know this 8 is always going to have the opposite parity than this 5, which means this 8's no longer a submarker. It's just a fully fledged member of our yellow parity. And if we have 2 different parities in the cell, we can go ahead and eliminate every other candidate in the cell because the parities are mutually exclusive. So another conclusion we can make from here is that this 8 that is submarked for a yellow parity can then be eliminated. Because if our blue parity is true, then it sees this blue candidate. If our yellow parity is true, it sees this 8. Therefore, this 8 can be eliminated. Now we have a by value cell. So we could turn this 7, we can color it yellow because it'll now be a member of the yellow parity. And then finally, we can make a really big conclusion here. We could see in box 8 here, we have 3 7s. If our yellow parity was true, this 1 would be true, which would eliminate this 7, and the 7 would be true, which would eliminate these 2 7s. So our yellow parity being true would empty this box of all its 7s, which of course is a contradiction, which means we could eliminate our yellow parity entirely and fill in all the members of our blue parity. And this is what it looks like when we fill in all the members of our blue parity. So as you can see, there's a lot of logical steps we have to make when we do graded equivalence marks, but we can get to really powerful conclusions that in many ways can replicate a lot of forcing nets, but with coloring instead. Bowman's bingo is another technique that can replicate a lot of the results of forcing nets. And like graded equivalence marks, it wasn't originally a coloring technique. The bingo part of the name comes from the fact that you could originally track the state of the candidates using bingo chips, and that's how the technique came about. The other part of the name, though, Bowman, comes from Doug Bowman, who contributed a lot to coloring as a technique. So Bowman's bingo was always very inspired by coloring techniques. And additionally, when you're doing Sudokus on a computer, then you kind of have to use coloring, unless if you want to tape bingo chips to your computer, but seems like a lot less effective. Unlike graded equivalence marks, though, Bowman bingo is actually a lot more depth first in the way it approaches things. Whereas graded equivalence marks, you track multiple different conditions for candidates. With Bowman bingo, you really just assume a candidate's true, go until that breaks, or until you have to make another assumption, and then you go until that breaks. And then maybe you could backtrack. So here I have a grid from Sudoku originally, but I actually found it from the Smart Hobbies YouTube channel, their video on Bowman bingo. Make sure to go check that out. That'll go a lot more in depth on Bowman bingo than I can go in this video. But what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and start off with this by value cell towards the top left. With Bowman bingo, whenever you make an assumption, it's best to do it in either a by value or a by local because you have a 50-50 shot of that initial assumption being correct. And I'm just going to go ahead and color this 1. Let's say that's our initial assumption. I want to go and color it blue. So with coloring in Bowman Bingo, there isn't a universal standard that I was able to find, but the cool thing about coloring is it's pretty easy to make your own coloring scheme as long as you can remember it. So with this first set of coloring, um, I'm going to say that all of the true candidates for this first assumption are going to be blue, and all the false candidates are going to be gray, or this brownish gray color right here. So if this one is true, this 6 is going to be gray, and this one is going to be gray. And I'm just going to go through and color this as far as we can go with just this blue-gray scheme. So here's what the implications of that initial assumption look like. If we were to assume this candidate was a 1, then all of the blue candidates would be forced to be true, and all of the gray candidates would be suppressed or forced to be false. And we don't notice any apparent contradictions from this yet. So what we could do now is then make a secondary assumption and see if that secondary assumption then forces a contradiction. So let's go ahead and go to this cell right here, another by-value cell, so a good assumption candidate. And we're going to say that from this second assumption, um, we'll go ahead and say this 6 is green, and anything that is forced by the secondary assumption will also be green. And then this 9 is going to be red, and anything that is suppressed by the secondary assumption will also have to be red. So let's go ahead and look at the implications of that secondary assumption. So this is as far as we can go with that secondary assumption, just assuming hidden singles and naked singles. And to be clear, this is conditional upon our first assumption. So anything that was grayed out by that first assumption is essentially invisible here. And red, again, is anything that is suppressed by that second assumption, and green is anything that is forced by that second assumption. So if we actually go through all the cells here, we'll notice this cell right here, the 6 was suppressed by our first assumption, and then both the 5 and the 9 were suppressed by that second assumption. So based on these two assumptions, this is an impossible state for the grid. Now, this doesn't say anything directly about either of our assumptions. It just says that the first assumption and then the second assumption can't be true. So what that means is, under our first assumption, what we could do is actually gray out this 6 that we assume to be true. Because if this initial 1 is true, then the 6 cannot be true, or else it leads to this contradiction where the cell is emptied out. So we're going to go ahead and color the 6 gray. And then we're going to go ahead and remove all of the red and green because we no longer need that secondary assumption. So if our 6 is incompatible with our first assumption, it essentially forces this cell to be a 9. So let's look at the implications of that. So if we follow the implications of that 9, which falls out of our first assumption, and we just use hidden singles and naked singles, this is the result. And it looks like we have the grid completely colored, so it looks like we have a solution, right? Well, not so fast, because if we actually look, this solution doesn't make any sense. Let's look at the 8s, for example. We could see that we have 2 8s that are forced in this row, 2 8s that are forced in this column. Both of those would be invalid states. We have 2 3s that are forced in this column. So essentially what all this means is that if we go back to our initial assumption, which was, if you remember, the 1 in this cell right here, that assumption leads to an invalid state of the grid. So we can go ahead and eliminate that. And that is the essence of Bowman's Bingo. Sometimes we might even have to do a third round of assumptions. The important thing is just that we pick a different coloring scheme for each round of assumptions that we do so we can keep track of the assumptions. It also helps to mark which cell you make all the assumptions, because it's pretty easy to forget. So if we just highlight the cell where we make each additional round of assumptions, that is also very helpful. But that about sums it up. And with that, we conclude this part on coloring techniques in Sudoku. A big thanks to Sudopedia for being the primary reference for the grids that we used in this video. The links to all those grids will be down in the description. Also, make sure to go check out Smart Hobby's video on Bowman Bingo if you want a more in-depth look on that. The link to that will be in the description as well. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to drop a like and a comment. And we will be continuing the series with the next part focusing on pattern-based techniques. So make sure to subscribe if you want to stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching.